my name is Sadie. Thank you so much for joining us for our March art break. It's really exciting to see the number of folks that are here today. Today I'm going to be presenting on anthropology and art in the Stanford Papua New Guinea Sculpture Garden. And for those of you that might be familiar with the Cantor, but not necessarily this garden, don't worry, a lot of folks haven't. It's right in front of Robley Dorm. So on the other side of campus, about a 10-minute walk from the Cantor. And it's sort of a secret garden. Not many people have made their way over there, but you should definitely check it out in person if you have the chance. So like I mentioned earlier, my name is Sadie, and I am an undergraduate student in social and cultural anthropology, and also a co-term student in Earth System Science. And I'm really interested in the intersection between anthropology and the environment, specifically thinking about how humans interact with both their built and natural environment, and how their environment influences the way that they live. And my family lives in a tiny town called Valdez, which is in Alaska. It's about population 4,000. And part of my interest in this sort of intersection between anthropology and earth systems comes from my interest in climate change and how climate change is impacting really vulnerable communities at the far north and around the equator. And so that very conveniently leads me to what I'm going to be presenting on today, which is art in Papua New Guinea. So Papua New Guinea is an island nation right next to Indonesia, a little bit north of Australia. And as you can see here, there is this nice little arrow pointing you to the Sepik River region, which is the focus of the art that we're going to be looking at today. The Sepik River is a really volatile river. There are a lot of different villages and towns that live along it, but it is the fourth longest river in the world, which is pretty crazy considering that most of us have probably never heard of it. And folks live up and down the river, mainly in a subsistence lifestyle, harvesting yams from the fertile soil that the river brings when it floods, and also eating things like crocodiles. And it's one of the main modes of transportation. So folks use this river to connect other waterways to get to like the capital, which is Port Moresby. And art has been a really big aspect of this region of Papua New Guinea for quite some time. In the tourist boom of 1980 and 1990 especially, a lot of tourists were traveling up and down the Sepik River and would purchase art from the different villages to take back with them, particularly Americans. And this right here is an example of some of the yam masks that artists in Papua New Guinea would paint, both for ceremonial reasons and also for tourists to purchase. So that was a huge source of income. And this garden in particular, so you might be wondering, how do we even get a garden with Papua New Guinean art here at Stanford? And part of the reason was this guy named Jim Mason. Jim Mason was a master's student in anthropology, had recently graduated from Stanford with his undergrad, and he was doing field work for his master's degree in the Sepik River Valley, particularly with this group called the Yatmal. And he was advised by Renato Rosaldo, who was the former chair of the anthropology department here at Stanford. And while Jim was doing field work there, two artists had gone to Australia for this international sculpture garden and were asked to carve some sculptures out of sandstone. And when they came back, they saw Jim Mason and they asked him, hey, is there an opportunity for you to do something similar to this, but at Stanford, so that we can go to Stanford and create more art and really get our names out there? And Jim, thinking a lot through reciprocity and anthropology, it's historically been a field where oftentimes anthropologists go to a different country or a different region, learn about the culture there, and then come back with the knowledge without really much, exchange in the other direction. He thought to himself, like, hey, maybe this is something that I could do. And so he came back to Stanford and sort of began going around and doing the rounds to try and see if this project was feasible. And it was a huge logistical endeavor. It involved raising initially $120,000 from different corporations and Palo Alto families, and going around to the different local businesses. It also looked like working with the Stanford Outdoor Art Committee to try and figure out if there was a location on campus that they could use. They considered 5 different locations, everywhere from like in front of the Oval by the little triangles by the Oval to where it currently is, which is in front of the Robley dorm. And what's really cool about this project is that the artists came on site and they were here the summer of 1994 for 4 months. They were on a 6-month visa. And during that time, in addition to all of the carvings, they really engaged with the Palo Alto community. They would work from 8 to 5 doing their carvings. And then on Friday nights, they would have these big barbecues and all of the people from Palo Alto would come out to try to talk to the artists and hear more about their work. And so all these photos are from this really lovely woman named Barbara Sloan, who lives in Palo Alto and was the project mother. She basically helped do fill in all the gaps, like drive the artists to get chisels from Home Depot when they needed them, or like organize like weekend trips. So during their time, they really got to engage. They went to places like Reno, they went to Cirque du Soleil, and it was really this fantastic experience of cross-cultural exchange. So as you can see here on the left, during the Friday night barbecues, they would have face painting for the kids. And the picture on the right is when they ended up leaving at the end of 4 months to head back to Papua New Guinea. And it was a really transformative experience for everyone. So that brings us to the artwork, which is currently on view, and you can go visit the Papua New Guinea Sculpture Garden in front of Robley Dorm. So as you sort of walk up to the garden, you'll see this really beautiful sculpture called Kura. And all of the sculptures here are made out of Papua New Guinean wood. So it's mainly Garamut wood, which is a pidgin word for the type of wood that they use, and then also quilla wood, which is sort of like African mahogany. And all the logs were actually shipped here from Papua New Guinea. Jim Mason was actually out there in the forest trying to find logs in people's backyards so that they would be dry enough to carve out of. So this sculpture is actually made out of Papua New Guinean wood, quilla wood, and the sculpture is named Kura, and it was made by 2 artists, Simon and Joe Murray, who carved it the summer of 1994. And what's really cool about this piece is that it's made out of 1 piece of wood. So even down to the wings and the wing tips of this sculpture, that's all made from 1 piece of wood, which you can see here. So the quilla wood tree is really interesting in that it has a really wide base. And so essentially they took the tree and they flipped it upside down so that the roots were facing up into the sky, and then they carved the wings out of the root base so they could carve it all out of 1 piece. And I can very quickly tell you the story behind the sculpture, which I think is really cool. So essentially Kura was this woman and her village was in the midst of this really big drought. And they went out into the river to look for food, and she ended up getting stranded in the middle of the river for a very long time. And this crocodile, which is a recurring animal in Sepik River Valley mythology, came up to Kura and said, "Hey, I will rescue you if you'll be my wife." And Kura said, no, I can't do that. But the crocodile continued to offer. And eventually Kura accepted, and they went back to the crocodile's lagoon, and she lived with him for several years, and they ended up having several crocodile human children. And Kura eventually, after a few years, got really lonely, and she really missed her family and her village. And so she begged her crocodile husband to allow her to return back to her home. And so this sculpture sort of depicts her son who again is half crocodile, half human, carrying her by the hair to give her back to her village. And traditionally, the Kura sculptures are placed at the top of a spirit house, which is a ceremonial center in Papua New Guinea. But obviously we weren't able to like construct an actual spirit house here on the Stanford campus. So instead, they put it in a mound right up in front of the rest of the sculptures. And there it is from a different angle and a little bit better lighting. And as you can see, it's a really intricate design, especially tourists are especially captivated by the wingspan, which is very cool. And that brings us to another sculpture. So as you continue entering into the garden, there's another sculpture that kids especially like to bang their hands on, and they're called Garamut drums. And if you remember what I mentioned earlier, Garamut wood is another type of wood that was used in the garden in addition to the quill wood. And it's also what they named the drums. They're called Garamut drums. And some interesting history behind the Garamut drums. So they're not like traditional drums where you have two drumsticks and you bang them on top. You have this pretty big stick and you like pound the sides of the drum. And there's this slit at the top of the drum that allows the noise to be made. And in World War II, because the radios would continue to like malfunction because it's so humid and so wet in Papua New Guinea, the radios would continually fail. So instead, they would use these Garamut drums to communicate with the other villagers, depending on who was controlling the village at the time. And you can actually hear these drums from about 17 miles away, which is pretty insane. So there are different codes that you can use with the drums to communicate. And like I mentioned earlier, crocodiles are a recurring theme throughout these poles and also in the different mythology. So the story goes that crocodiles were actually played a pretty big role in the creation of the world. So before, if you the world was basically like a water-air sandwich, and a crocodile actually like came and this wind blew to basically separate the wind, to separate the air from the land. So as, sorry, the air from the water. And the wind continued to blow and this crocodile came along and it was swimming and swimming and swimming looking for land. And eventually it actually became the land itself. And so in Yatmul and Kwoma mythology, the crocodile, the earth as we know it is actually a crocodile, a living, breathing human being. And what's actually crazy is that these artists flew here, obviously, from Papua New Guinea by way of Hong Kong. And essentially, they were looking out, you know, from the windows of the airplanes on their way here. And one of them commented like, wow, the earth has gotten really, really big. It's gotten really, really bloated. It's been eating all of the bad things. And it's just gotten way bigger than we could have ever imagined, which I think is a really cool story of the way in which even the plane ride to America impacted them. And as you can see here, it's a fairly big drum and it has cowrie shell eyes. And it was also carved in the summer of 1994. And I think one of the docents of that gives tours of the Papua New Guinea Sculpture Garden really put it best. You know, oftentimes this garden is forgotten because it is, you know, like sort of in the secluded little grove in front of Robley, in front of the storm. And people, you know, even on a busy street like Santa Teresa, people are always rushing and biking and blowing through stop signs. And they don't really pause and look through the sort of forested area to realize that this garden is even here. But it's really incredible that we were able to bring a group of 11 artists from Papua New Guinea to engage with the Palo Alto community and, you know, build these sculptures and create these sculptures to leave with us here at Stanford for the public to enjoy. And it's especially important to remember their stories as we continue to see the impacts of climate change around the globe. Papua New Guinea is, part of the Pacific Islands, and because of climate change, a lot of land is disappearing as a result of sea level rise. And starting to think about where people will go, and cross-cultural exchange is going to be a really important aspect of our future as we think about the impacts of climate change and migration, and where people will go when they can't stay home. So thank you all so much for joining me on this tour. I'm really excited and happy to answer any questions that you might have. Oh, thank you, Lisa. Kura's children are part crocodile, part eagle, and they're both symbols of male power in Papua New Guinea. Really appreciate that. And apparently I've been pronouncing Sepik wrong this entire time. It's actually pronounced Sepik with a long E. So thank you also for that, Lisa. Amy asked, is there a complicated history on this because of a white instructor going to Papua New Guinea to ask artists to come here? I think there are interesting dynamics, but it's something that anthropology as a field, is continually reckoning with. It's historically been a pretty white field, going to developing countries to do research. I think Jim Mason had the best of intentions, and he really framed it as, wanting to bring his friends here to sort of offer up opportunities to them and really allow them the freedom to create their own art in a new Western context. Mackenzie asked, what's your favorite part of the Papua New Guinea Sculpture Garden? I think something that's really cool is that when Jim Mason brought the artists back here. So they came back. So they were here in 1994 and then also again in 1996 for the opening ceremony. And this story was actually told to me by Barbara Sloan. But essentially, Jim Mason rigged up the garden so that there was a huge sheet covering all of the sculptures. Up until that point, they had been lying on the ground for 2 years. And he set them all up and drilled poles up into their base and installed them and covered them in a sheet. And basically when the artist came off the plane in 1996, he had it all jerry-rigged so that if he pulled the sheet with a rope, the lights would come on and illuminate all the sculptures. So the artists came along, someone picked them up and brought them to the garden, and it was twilight, and Jim Mason finally showed them, the product of all of their hard work by pulling on the ropes, and they were completely aghast. They were like, oh my goodness, this is insane, with all the light shining up. And if you ever get the chance to go to the garden at night, it's really a very cool experience to see everything illuminated from below. Yeah, how do you maintain the sculptures in Palo Alto? Will the different environments cause any difficulties in methods? That's a really great question, and something that folks put a ton of time and energy into thinking about. Papua New Guinea is a lot more humid than it is here in Palo Alto, obviously, and they were actually concerned about the wood exploding when they brought it over from Papua New Guinea. There was concern among experts that the minute that they opened up the cargo container, the wood would just explode because of the different humidity levels. But clearly that wasn't the case. Essentially in Papua New Guinea, these last for about 70 years, and the poles are actually long enough that you can bury them about 8 feet underground. And eventually they rot away because, again, it's so humid and so moist. Here in Palo Alto, again, we're a lot drier of a climate, and Jim Mason actually took some methods to sort of mitigate that. Instead of burying the poles underground, which is what's traditionally done, he instead, created his own machine to drill huge huge metal rods up into the sculpture, and then installed them into cement underneath. So they're holding up pretty well. Obviously, they're made of wood and they're in an outdoor environment, so they're not going to last forever. But I think Jim Mason described it as like a very slow kinetic sculpture. And, they've lasted 30 years so far. So hopefully they'll last us a much longer time. Yeah, Cantor Scholar tie-in and research plans in Papua New Guinea. So this is, in addition to being a tour guide, I'm also a Cantor Scholar. And that basically means that I'm doing this, my own independent research project on a piece of art or a collection of art with a Cantor. And I picked the Papua New Guinea Sculpture Garden. I'm an anthropology major, and I was really intrigued by reading the signs my freshman year of how this garden was created by, a graduate student in anthropology who was only a couple years older than me. And yeah, I was very intrigued by how he did it, because there's not a whole lot of information online. If you look him up on Wikipedia, or if you look up the Papua New Guinea Sculpture Garden on Wikipedia, there really isn't much information about the different stories. Or the specifics of how the garden came to be, or the experiences of the Palo Alto residents and the ways in which they interact with the artists, or even what happened to the artist afterwards. So I've sort of taken a deep dive into the garden to try and do more research, which has been a really fantastic experience. Awesome. Thank you all so much for coming out. And if anyone has any other questions, I can put my email in the chat, and feel free to email me.